Hello and welcome back to Deck Doctor episode 17, and this week we're going to take a look at red-yellow combat burn. This is actually one of my favourite archetypes in Faeria. It's kind of a mixture of early game control followed by massive bursts of pressure using that Scourge Flame Spectre and the burn damage that's available in this list. So I'm a big fan of this deck. It hasn't seen much play as of recent. But, you know, it's done very well in tournaments in the past. So all you want to do is you want to build towards your Scourge Flame, going towards a well, defend, collect Faeria, and eventually unleash hell upon your opponent and deal massive amounts of damage. So let's take a look at the cards and see what they do. Red-Yellow Combat Burn takes advantage of the burn-based combat creatures, but also uses one of the Underground Boys. Underground Brigand, it's just a cheap harvester to get you set up in the early game, but also gives you a bit of Faeria back as well when you deal combat damage, and this can be pretty important when trying to pay for a Scourge Flame in the later game because they are quite pricey. Now, Grimguard and Shedding Brood both offer burn damage through the combat ability, whereas Grimguard is more of a defender, and Brute you can use a bit more aggressively. And when you combine these cards with stuff like Kaleem's Training and Flashwind, they can deal massive amounts of damage to your opponent's orb, so your opponent must respect them and deal with them before you unleash some devastating combos. Apart from the combat creatures, you do have some heavy hitters. We have Cypher, Blood Tyrant, a very powerful legendary card that can absorb the stats of any enemy he destroys. Most of the time, he's just going to be a very sturdy 5/6 for 5 Faeria. But when you combine this with stuff like Kaleem's Training and Flashwind, you can access many parts of the board and start increasing his power with his ability. Ground Shaker, time and time and again this card shows up in red decks. Very solid card, does a bit of burn damage, does a bit of board damage as well, and a very solid 5/6 creature for 6 Faeria. These events allow you to pick up some removal, but also deal some damage to your opponent as well. Cypher's Wrath, again, red staple, 2 damage to your opponent's orb as well. So this can be used to help you maintain board pressure, defend, but also deal some additional damage to your opponent as well. Flame Burst, again, you can use this on creatures. Most of the times you're going to want to save this for the orb. There's going to help that Scourge Flame finish off your opponent. But if you need to use it on board to make sure you don't get overrun, by all means, use this card as a defensive tool. Last but not least, we have Gift of Steel. Now, this card is best used on a combat creature, but don't be afraid to use it on something like a Ground Shaker or a Cypher if you need to make a defensive play or push additional damage with your offensive lines. So this card does get the most value out of combat creatures, but if you can use it on other creatures like Ground Shaker or Cypher in the right situation, it can be very rewarding. These are the only 2 yellow cards in the deck, and they are big parts of why this deck is so successful. Flashwind allows you to move your creatures an additional tile, which gives you a lot of reach. It allows you to push damage. It also lets you defend from difficult positions. But when you combine that with Kaleem's Training, your creatures can get around the board very easily. When the common tactics is to set up a creature on your own well, and then use the Kaleem's Training, double collect with the Kaleem's Training, then Flashwind them straight to your opponent's orb and deal damage. And when you combine this with combat creatures like Grimguard and Shedding Brood, they can unleash hell very quickly because their combat ability does trigger on your opponent's orb, so they can deal massive amounts of damage. And this is a great way of coming back in a game if you're behind, being able to push that last bit of damage of your burn with the Kaleem's Training and Flashwind, but also it means your opponent must respect that your creatures can pretty much get anywhere on the board with this combination, and it is very deadly. So these 2 cards are key to winning with this red-yellow burn list. Last but not least, we have the finisher of the deck, and that is Scourge Flame Spectre. Flying Haste, charge 2 creature that costs 6 lands, but in combat, he deals 3 damage to your opponent. So he is a 2/5 as a standard creature. If you hit your opponent's orb with him, he's going to deal 5 damage. He can be empowered with Gift of Steel, so he does gain the full benefit from that card because he is a combat creature, which further extends its reach. further extends its survivability, and you can deal massive amounts of damage. Now, the biggest drawback for Scourge Flame is it costs 7. So most of the time, when you're getting up to the kind of 5-6 land mark, if you do have Scourge Flame in hand, if you do want to use it on the turn that you build your 6th land, you're going to need to have some Faeria saved up. And that means you're going to have to relieve pressure off you or take a bit of damage, because most of the time your opponent's going to be coming at you at that point. So you need to plan when you can get this card out, because it is quite pricey. But when it does come down, it is incredibly deadly, because you need to remove it with hard removal, damage-based removal, transform effects, because if you don't, if your opponent swings into it with a creature, they are going to take 3 damage from its combat ability. It's a very powerful card, really ties this deck together, and yeah, your opponent's going to fear this card when it comes down. For your mulligan, you are going to want to find a creature to start harvesting Faeria for you and applying pressure to your opponent. Underground Brigand, Shedding Brute, and Cypher, all great starters. These cards will be cheap enough to play on turn 2. And they have additional abilities that can help you when defending against your opponent a little later on. Also, Groundshaker and Grimguard are good choices as well. You basically just want a creature, and then you can look for some utility cards. As for those utility cards, Cypher's Wrath or Flame Burst are good pickups. You can use them as removal if you need to control the Faeria Wells. Gift of Steel is very good if you pick up a combat creature, because you'll be able to extend its power and give your opponent a hard time. Now, one card I do like to keep, and some may not agree with me, is Kaleem's Training. And the reason is this card is usually so important to your mid game to be able to apply pressure and deal orb damage. And Kaleem's Training Flashwind can sometimes be the winning line for you. You may not even need Scourge Flame, because you can catch your opponent off guard and apply pressure with your creatures. So I like to keep this, but you do need to prioritize a creature first. So once you get that creature, if you do have a training as well, try keeping a hold of it, because you'll find it'll be very important to your win condition. So how much does this deck cost altogether? And then the Memoria cost is on the pretty low side. You've got 8 commons, 15 rares, 6 epics, and 1 legendary. So that's not a lot at all when it comes to epics and legendaries. And the total cost is 1,140 Memoria. Now, because it's fairly cheap already, the only change that I would probably recommend is swapping out Cypher if you don't already own him, and putting it in the Underground Brigand. Just gives you an extra creature to play in the early game. It doesn't quite have the same power level as Cypher, but that does reduce the cost of the deck by 320 Memoria. So it makes it a lot cheaper. So if you are missing that Cypher, Brigand is a very good replacement. Let's take a look at the strengths and weaknesses. This deck has massive damage potential with the Scourge Flame Spectre, the Shedding Brutes and Grimguards with Gift of Steels, but because of Kaleem's Training and Flashwind, it gives you a lot of reach and allows you to push a lot of orb damage. Removal and burn, you have great removal options, Cypher's Wrath, a Flame Burst, but these can also add that damage to the orb against your opponents, and this is all going to add up when that Scourge Flame comes down. And you can win games by playing aggressively and defensively. Now, what I mean by this is you can play the generic aggro plan when you just go at one side and summon a Scourge Flame and go in. But if you're on the defensive, maybe you're defending against a rush deck, that burn damage is going to start adding up, especially if you defend very well. And of course, at some point, you'll be able to Kaleem's Training Flashwind one of your creatures to their orb, and then they're going to have to start defending, but usually it's too late because they've taken too much damage from your burn cards. Now, some of the problems this deck has is no hard removal. We are using yellow, but there is no room for Last Nightmare. I kind of feel like the deck in this current list is very streamlined for what it wants to do. It wants to burn you, it wants to apply pressure, and has some good defensive options. But I feel if you were to put Last Nightmare in the list, the deck becomes incredibly clunky because you have to prioritize deserts, and you don't run any yellow creatures or all red creatures, so you always want to prioritize mountains in the early game. So if you start putting out hard removal in, you start to make things a bit clunky. Big creatures can cause a problem. You don't have any hard removal. Most of the time you're going to have to throw damage at it or use a combat creature with a Gift of Steel in order to take it down. Now, most cases you want these Gift of Steels, you want these combat creatures to go to the orb or take value by 2-for-1 and to get the most out of the combat ability, but big creatures can be a big problem. It's hard to come back because of Scourge Flame's high Faeria cost. Now, if you ever fall behind in a late game, you sometimes have to wait a turn to generate enough Faeria to play a Scourge Flame, and that can be enough time for your opponent to finish you off, or Scourge Flame will not be enough at that point, especially if your opponent does pack some healing, and Emperor's Command is a very popular card at the moment. So that can be one of the weaknesses, Scourge Flame costing so much Faeria and being very hard to use as a comeback card. For your land placement, you want to start off with mountains and build towards a well. So the usual starting is going to be 2 mountains so you can play your first creature, followed by a desert so they can collect from your own well. And then where you go from here is entirely up to you. Now, it very much depends, I find, on what your opponent decides to do. Now, the first option is if your opponent isn't challenging you on your side by building land, you can build straight up towards your opponent's well, and as you can see here, you have 2 avenues for your Scourge Flames to attack your opponent, from the side of their orb and from the center. Now, if your opponent decides to challenge you by building lands towards you, you can build your lands in a different way, and this way is towards the center of the board, and this again gives you 2 avenues for your Scourge Flame to attack. And that's how you want to build your land. So a good rule of thumb is, if your opponent's not challenging you, go up towards the wells. If your opponent is coming towards you, go towards the middle. And this will give you all your Scourge Flame avenues you need for the late game. That wraps up this episode of Deck Doctor. I was very surprised to see that I hadn't covered this list yet on the Faeria channel, so I'm very happy to do a Deck Doctor on it because I really enjoy this deck and I'm a big fan. If you do like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to keep up to date of when our video content goes live, be sure to drop a subscribe. If you haven't already, check out faeria.com/the-hub for all the latest guides, decks and articles by the community and by myself. So until next time, guys, take care and have a great day.